From an industrial explosion in Texas that eviscerated this port city, and an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico that triggered the worst spill in American history, to a port in Beirut that exploded when 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate caught fire, and a department store collapse in South Korea that trapped 1,000 people under the rubble. Here are 10 of the biggest man-made disasters of all time. Now, we've come a long way since the Stone Age. We've invented, built, and done things once thought impossible. But with these accomplishments come several disasters that could have been avoided. Things like Chernobyl and Titanic usually come to mind. But we know those stories. In this video, we'll cover 10 lesser-known disasters, starting with a butter-fueled tunnel fire under the French Alps. The Mont Blanc Tunnel is a 7-mile underground roadway connecting Chamonix, France to Courmayeur, Italy. It opened in July of 1965 and has been carrying commuters and commercial vehicles under the Alps ever since. On March 24th of 1999, a truck carrying 12 tons of flour and 9 tons of margarine entered the tunnel around 10:45 a.m. Around midway, the driver noticed smoke coming from his engine. Within minutes, the cab was on fire. It quickly spread to the trailer, where the flour and butter went up like gasoline. The first alarm went off when a passing motorist stopped and grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall. But the raging fire couldn't be quelled, and smoke quickly filled the Mont Blanc tunnel. The second alarm tripped at 10:52, prompting a shutdown on both ends. No cars were allowed in, and those stuck inside had trouble getting out. Drivers on either end ditched their vehicles and ran on foot. However, this hindered the rescue operation, as trucks couldn't reach the fire. Firefighters who did make it had to take shelter in one of the tunnel's refuge rooms. At 11:11, an Italian fire truck came within 1,000 feet of the fire, but was forced to retreat due to intense heat. The tight-packed tunnel was like a 2,000-degree oven. Poor communication systems prevented those battling the blaze from talking to people on the outside. Those in charge didn't think the issue was that serious. Instead of pivoting to search and rescue, they focused on fighting an unfightable fire. In the end, 39 people perished, all of them on the French side. They couldn't breathe as the tunnel filled with smoke faster than they could run. The fire finally went out 53 hours later. In the aftermath, 16 people were brought to trial, all facing manslaughter charges. One former French executive blamed the fire on the tunnel's operating procedures. It was controlled 50-50 by an Italian company and a French company. Neither had proper communication systems and fumbled the ball when coordinating firefighting efforts that day. The tunnel's ventilation systems also played a crucial role. They were pumping too much fresh air into the tunnel. It was like throwing gasoline on a butter fire. The Bullock Museum in Austin, Texas, has one of the coolest pieces of American industrial history on display. It's a piece of shrapnel from the SS Grand Camp, which exploded in the port of Texas City like a 437-foot-long hand grenade. It was April 16th of 1947. The SS Grand Camp had been reactivated to aid in rebuilding France after World War II. It was loaded with machinery, twine, peanuts, tobacco, and small weapons. It also had about 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate on board. This highly explosive compound came to Texas via rail from factories in Iowa and Nebraska. It was packaged in paper sacks and transported in rail cars at high temperatures, increasing its reactivity. When they reached Texas, dock workers said the bags felt warm to the touch. Around 8 a.m. on the 16th, somebody spotted smoke in the Grand Camp's cargo hold. A fire quickly spread, and workers began battling the blaze with a 1-gallon bucket and 2 fire extinguishers. That's when the captain forbade anyone from using water, as it would risk ruining the cargo. Well, so would fire, but nobody wanted to question the boss. The hatches were sealed and the cargo bed filled with steam. The captain thought this would smother the fire, but it only made things worse. Shortly after 9 a.m., the SS Grand Camp detonated like a nuclear bomb. The blast vaporized anything within 2,000 feet. A 15-foot tsunami raced toward the shore and flattened over 1,000 coastal buildings, including a chemical plant with 450 workers inside. Of them, 145 perished when the building collapsed. Shrapnel and other pieces of the Grand Camp's cargo flew roughly 3,000 feet. In some places, peanuts, tobacco, and spools of twine rained down. According to reports, people over 250 miles away in Louisiana felt the shockwave. To this day, the Texas City disaster is considered the worst industrial accident in U.S. history. A chain reaction of floods, building collapses, and other explosions claimed the lives of 581 people, including 99% of the city's volunteer fire department. Rumor has it that somebody flicked their cigarette into the cargo hold the night before. The ammonium nitrate smothered and burned overnight, meaning it was already too late when they discovered the fire in the morning. Tenerife is the largest and most populated of the Canary Islands. Today, it's home to roughly 948,000 people who rely on the Tenerife airport, formerly Los Rodeos, to travel on and off the island. In 1977, Tenerife Airport made international headlines when two Boeing 747 passenger jets collided on the runway. Of the 644 people between both planes, only 61 escaped. As of 2024, the Tenerife crash is the worst accident in aviation history. But how is that possible? How did two fully loaded planes collide on the runway? The planes involved were KLM Flight 4805 and Pan American World Airways Flight 1736. Throughout the story, we'll refer to them as KLM and Pan Am. Both planes were en route to Grand Canary Island when they diverted to Tenerife after a bomb detonated at the Gran Canaria airport. Many planes were diverted to Tenerife, which turned the runway into gridlock flight traffic. They jammed up the only taxiway, thus forcing departing planes to taxi on the runway. In other words, they only had one lane with planes flying in each direction. To make matters worse, a dense fog moved over the airport, reducing visibility for pilots and the ATC tower. Finally, at 4:56 p.m., KLM had clearance to taxi down the runway, turn around, and use it for takeoff. Minutes later, Pan Am was instructed to follow but take the third exit to avoid a collision. So far, everything was going according to plan. Then, for some reason, the Pan Am flight decided to skip their exit. The dense fog blocked their view of the KLM plane racing toward them. By the time they saw each other, it was too late. An investigation determined that the KLM pilot thought he had clearance for takeoff. Meanwhile, the control tower thought KLM was stationary, so it told Pan Am to start taxiing. Investigators blamed the crash on KLM's duty time regulations, suggesting the pilot ignored safety protocol to ensure an on-time flight. Dutch authorities have rejected this claim. They don't deny their pilot was at fault, but weather, the congested runway, and general chaos were all critical factors. According to international reports, Lebanon was a very bad place in early 2020. Unemployment was skyrocketing, inflation was out of control, and poverty rates were above 50%. Then the COVID era began, and for some, it felt like things couldn't get any worse. They were wrong. On August 4th of 2020, a massive explosion at the port of Beirut nearly leveled the entire city. Images from the blast site made it look like a bomb had gone off. And that's because one basically did. According to former Lebanese Prime Minister Hassan Diab, who submitted his resignation in the wake of the Beirut explosion, roughly 2,750 tons, not pounds, tons of ammonium nitrate was stored in a port warehouse. And it didn't just arrive either. The explosive material had been sitting for 6 years after being confiscated from a Moldovan cargo ship. It baked in the hot Middle Eastern sun, like a time bomb waiting to go off. It finally did around 6 p.m. on August 4th. A warehouse fire broke out roughly 20 minutes before the blast. Alongside the ammonium nitrate, the warehouse also stored fireworks. We'd love to meet the genius who put those two things together. When firefighters arrived, they heard what they could only describe as a crazy sound coming from inside the warehouse. That sound was the ammonium nitrate getting ready to blow. The initial blast was like detonating nearly 2.5 tons of TNT. It created a thick cloud of gray smoke that plumed over the warehouse. About 30 seconds later, the main explosion was reminiscent of U.S. nuclear test blasts in the Pacific Ocean. A mushroom cloud covered the entire city. The shockwave leveled buildings, flipped cars, and was felt as far away as Cyprus. Local seismographs registered the blast as a 3.3 magnitude earthquake. Experts from the University of Sheffield said it was unquestionably one of the largest non-nuclear blasts ever recorded in human history. As of 2024, nobody has been held accountable for the blast. Amnesty International called the lackluster investigation an unacceptable lack of justice, truth, and reparation. At least 235 people lost their lives in the blast, fire, and resulting building collapses. None of their families feel as though justice has been served. Sadly, none of them likely will. Bangladesh's ready-made garment industry, or RMG, accounts for a whopping 84% of its exports. It's second behind China in terms of global garments exports in general. Sadly, many workers are severely underpaid. Working conditions are lacking, and, allegedly, over 4,500 sweatshops are active in the country. The intersection of clothes and exploitation is located in the Dhaka district. Today, it's an overgrown plot in a densely populated city. In 2013, it was the site of a deadly workplace disaster. The Rana Plaza was built in 2006 to house several garment factories and other commercial buildings. It employed roughly 5,000 people who stitched clothes for brands like Walmart, Primark, Joe Fresh, and The Children's Place. On April 23rd of 2013, a newscast reported cracks in the side of Rana Plaza. The lower floors were evacuated, including a bank and several retail shops. The upper floors, where the garment factories were, ordered their workers to return on the 24th. The owners allegedly threatened to withhold a month's pay from anyone who refused to return. On the morning of April 24th, a power outage on the top floor kick-started automatic diesel generators. The building was so fragile that the vibrating engines caused it to collapse. At 8:57 a.m., Rana Plaza came crashing down with 3,100 garment workers inside. Of them, over 1,100 perished in the disaster, and thousands more were injured. Some survivors were trapped for hours. Others spent days waiting for someone to find them. While the engines triggered the collapse, it was caused by years of neglect and greed. Amnesty International called it the most shocking recent example of business-related human rights abuse. The building was only 7 years old. Every brick was laid with corruption. In 2016, 38 people were charged with murder. Among them were the factory owners who threatened to withhold wages if their workers didn't come back. As of 2024, the murder trial is still pending. The only person in custody is the building's owner, Sohail Rana. Everyone else is either out on bail, actively fleeing police, or dead. The Titanic might be the most famous shipwreck of all time, but it's not the worst, not by far. That distinction goes to the MV Dona Paz, the deadliest peacetime ocean disaster in history. The Dona Paz was a passenger ferry sailing under the Philippine flag. When it launched in 1963, it had an operating capacity of 608 people. Remember that figure. It'll be important later on. It was December 20th of 1987. The Dona Paz was preparing to depart from Leyte Island en route to the Philippine capital of Manila. It was an overnight journey, and most of the passengers were asleep around 10:30 when the Dona Paz entered the Tablas Strait. At the same time, the oil tanker MT Vector was en route from Bataan to Masbate, carrying over 1,000 tons of gasoline and other petroleum products. As the story goes, only one crew member was keeping watch on the Dona Paz's bridge. Everyone else was drinking beer and playing cards. The captain was allegedly watching a movie in his quarters. That's when the Dona Paz collided with the MT Vector, causing its flammable cargo to ignite. The fire quickly spread to the Dona Paz, where people were awoken to intense heat and thick smoke. Here's where things get dicey. The Dona Paz was severely overcrowded. Roughly 1,500 registered passengers were on board, and another 2,000 were crammed inside and not listed on the ship's manifest. People slept in hallways and stacked 3 or 4 bodies per bunk bed. This figure climbed until 1999, when an investigation determined that 4,342 passengers and 58 crew were on board the Dona Paz. Of them, only 26 survived. An additional 11 workers perished on the MT Vector. That same investigation found the MT Vector liable for the crash, as it operated without a license, lookout, or qualified master. It was also deemed unseaworthy, but they set sail anyway. Those who survived the crash were between a rock and a hot place. Oil from the MT Vector set the water around the Dona Paz on fire. They had no choice but to jump in and swim beneath the flames. The overcrowded ferry was blamed on Christmas. During the holiday season, many tickets were bought, duplicated, and sold illegally. Those 2,000 unlisted people likely bought fake tickets for themselves and their family members. Those holding complimentary tickets and non-paying children under 4 were also unlisted. Of the 26 survivors, only 5 were named on the ship's official manifest. San Juanico is a small town just north of Mexico City. Many of those still living there bear mental and physical scars from the early morning hours of November 19, 1984. They awoke to a massive explosion as a fireball of liquefied petroleum engulfed their town. San Juanico used to house a storage and distribution terminal for liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG. Pemex, a state-owned company, operated the facility and controlled about 1/3 of Mexico City's LPG supply. Pemex claims the facility was up to code. However, 2 months before the explosion, inspections revealed that between 30 and 40% of the safety equipment was either bypassed or non-functioning. The facility was a mess. Pressure gauges were inaccurate, and some relief valves were not in working order. At the time, about 100,000 people lived between San Juanico and surrounding communities. All of them were in danger when, at 5:40 a.m., pressure dropped in a pipeline roughly 25 miles away. It ruptured, causing gas to leak for nearly 10 minutes. The leak created a massive gas cloud that floated toward a flare and ignited. This set off a chain reaction of exploding LPG tanks. According to some estimates, the fireballs grew close to 1,000 feet in diameter. They eviscerated homes and burned everything in their wake. A pilot flying overhead thought somebody had dropped a nuclear bomb on Mexico City. 5 plant workers and between 500 and 600 people living within 1,000 feet of the blast perished in their sleep. Another 5,000 to 7,000 people suffered severe burns. Garcia Dominguez was a 16-year-old mechanic living in San Juanico when the blast occurred. As a boy, his mother always told him that bad people burn in the afterlife. When he awoke and saw the fire and felt the heat, he honestly thought he had died and gone to hell. Most people remember the BP oil spill. Some people probably default to the "we're sorry" South Park gag. But the story behind the largest oil spill in the history of marine drilling operations is so much worse. On April 20th of 2010, an explosion on board Deepwater Horizon claimed the lives of 11 workers and seriously injured 17 more. The oil rig, located about 50 miles off the shore of Louisiana, was built to operate in waters up to 10,000 feet. It was 10 years old and under a 5-year charter with the BP Oil Company. In April of 2010, Deepwater Horizon was drilling at the Macondo prospect, a rich oil well in the Gulf of Mexico. The well was under 5,000 feet of water, meaning the rig was within comfortable operating depth. Offshore drilling requires a pathway between the rig and the oil well on the sea floor. To reach the black gold, rigs like Deepwater Horizon drill a deep hole or a well bore through the subsea rock and sediment. Aside from crude oil, these layers contain unwanted things like water and natural gas. When those unwanteds flow into the well bore, it can lead to a blowout, also known in the industry as a kick. Kicks can trigger the uncontrollable release of flammable oil and gas from the ocean floor. It'll shoot up the wellbore and quickly reach the main rig. It only takes a tiny spark to blow the entire thing. The blowout preventer, or BOP, prevents kicks from happening. Think of it as an automatic, multi-stage emergency shutoff. If all stages fail, the BOP is designed to cut the line and save the rig. Around 8:45 p.m. on April 20th, a kick occurred at the well. Oil and gas slipped by the BOP undetected and rose quickly toward the rig. About an hour later, drilling mud blew out all over the rig, signaling to the crew that a kick had occurred. They manually enacted their safety measures, but it was too late. Intense pressure inside the main pipe caused it to bend. This prevented the BOP from cutting the line, as the blades couldn't reach it. At 9:49 p.m., the oil and gas found an ignition source and exploded, causing all electrical power to be lost. The only thing that could save Deepwater Horizon were backup battery systems in the BOP. As fate would have it, both had been miswired and failed catastrophically. There was nothing left to stop the fire and ensuing oil spill. The entire platform was engulfed in flames, forcing the 126 on board to leap into the water. Of them, 94 were rescued by helicopter or lifeboat, 17 were severely burned and injured, and 11 were never found. 2 days later, Deepwater Horizon collapsed and sank, causing 210 million gallons of oil to leak from the Macondo well for 87 days. Ultimately, BP paid roughly $65 billion in fines, settlements, and cleanup fees. But hey, they're sorry. The Sampoong department store in Seoul, South Korea opened its unstable doors in December of 1989. Construction began in 1987 and was among many buildings that went up too quickly due to the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics. It featured 4 underground floors and 5 additional above-ground floors. All 9 were a house of cards waiting to fall. The 1988 Games sparked a development boom in South Korea. At the time, laws prevented international contractors from building in the country, which meant South Korean builders were severely overloaded. Some favored speed over safety to finish all their contracts on time. By the mid-90s, Sampoong was doing $500,000 per day in sales. Its owner and manager Lee Jun was raking in the cash. He would soon become the most despised man in South Korea. During construction, Lee Jun made several changes to the blueprint. He removed several support columns in favor of escalators and added a 5th floor, which was never planned. When the contractor refused these changes over safety concerns, Lee fired him and hired his own people. In April of 1995, cracks appeared on Lee's 5th floor. Engineers deemed the building unsafe, but instead of evacuating, Lee ordered all the merchandise to be brought into the basement levels. In June, more cracks appeared, yet management dug their heels in. An unusually high number of customers were in the building, and C-Suite didn't want to miss out on sales. Engineering experts arrived and told the executives that Sampoong was doomed to collapse at any second. Lee Jun refused to listen and declined to evacuate for fear of revenue loss. He, however, and the rest of the executives left the building safely. The top floor finally failed. Within 20 seconds, the thin support columns collapsed and all 5 floors came crashing down. Over 2,000 people were shopping inside when it happened. Of them, 502 perished and 1,500 were trapped beneath the rubble. In December of 1995, Lee Jun was found guilty of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He got out in 2003, but died due to complications from diabetes, high blood pressure, and kidney disease several months later. The 81-year-old passed away as one of the most hated people in South Korean history. The Aral Sea used to be the 4th largest saltwater lake in the world. By the late 2000s, it was a barren wasteland with a few puddles. We can thank the Soviet Union for that one. What remains of the Aral Sea sits between southern Kazakhstan and northern Uzbekistan. Pre-1960, it was a thriving ecosystem fed by 2 primary rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. Both rivers fed the lake via rain and snowmelt from far-off mountains. The Soviets wanted some of that water for themselves. In the 1950s, Khrushchev's government established a program to boost agriculture, specifically cotton in Russian territory. He had the bright idea of diverting water from the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya to irrigate the arid lands around the Aral Sea. His plan worked, but at a significant cost. By the late 1980s, Uzbekistan had become the world's largest cotton producer. However, much of the water diverted from the Aral Sea went to waste. According to a Columbia University study, between 25 and 75% of the water dried up in the desert. There wasn't enough rain to sustain the Aral Sea. What used to be a 26,000 square mile lake is now a puddle between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's surrounded by fisheries and ghost towns that once depended on the lake for survival. At its peak in 1957, the Aral Sea produced over 48,000 tons of fish, accounting for 13% of the Soviet Union's fish stocks. When the farms moved in, fertilizer and pesticides mixed with the blowing salt dust from the exposed lakebed, creating a public health hazard. Ironically, that same salt dust, roughly 40 million metric tons, blew over their new farms and spoiled the fertilized land. It was like Mother Nature taking revenge. To save the Aral Sea, Kazakhstan built a dam between its northern and southern parts. Construction finished in 2005, and the dam helped rebound the lake, at least enough that some fisheries could thrive again. Sadly, the Aral Sea is unlikely to return to its former glory. If you enjoyed this video and want to see another just like it, be sure to click the link on screen now. With that, thanks for watching and be sure to tune in next time.